What if I told you that the calendar hanging on your wall, the clock that rules your daily schedule, even the way we divide weeks and months, might not be the system God originally gave to humanity? What if buried deep in ancient texts lies a completely different design of time, one so precise, so divine, that even the angels themselves were said to guard it? And what if I also told you that this very revelation was hidden, suppressed, and even banned from most of the Christian world for centuries? Welcome to the Book of Jubilees, a text sometimes called Little Genesis. To some, it is a forgotten curiosity. To others, especially within the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, it is a holy book that has been preserved for thousands of years. But for much of the world, it is virtually unknown because early church leaders decided it did not belong in the official Bible. Why? That question alone is enough to spark controversy. But as we'll see, the answer runs deeper than a simple decision about canon. The Book of Jubilees doesn't just retell the familiar stories of Genesis and Exodus. It adds details that shake the foundations of how we think about creation, time, and God's law. At its core, this book makes one daring claim, that time itself has a divine order, and humanity abandoned it. Jubilees describes a calendar of 364 days, divided with mathematical precision, where sacred days always fall exactly when they should. It insists that this is the calendar written into creation itself, guarded by angels, and given as a covenant to humanity. In contrast, the calendars we follow today, the lunar cycles, the Roman revisions, the modern Gregorian system, are presented as corruptions, distortions that pull humanity out of alignment with God. Can you feel the weight of that? If Jubilees is right, then we've been living on borrowed rhythms for centuries, maybe millennia. Our entire sense of time could be out of sync with the Creator. And that raises an unsettling question. If the world is offbeat, what does that do to our lives, our worship, even our connection with God? But before we get to the calendar itself, we need to ask, why was this book hidden? If it carried such powerful insight, why did the early church decide to banish it from the canon? Was it simply because they considered it unnecessary? Or was there something more, something they didn't want ordinary believers to see? Imagine for a moment being part of the early Christian community. Books and scrolls were being circulated, some containing familiar teachings, others presenting strange ideas. The leaders of the church faced a choice, what to include as inspired and what to leave out. In the case of Jubilees, they chose exclusion. But even as they silenced it in most parts of the world, the Ethiopian church continued to copy, study, and treasure this book as sacred scripture. And to this day, in Ethiopia, it remains a cornerstone of their biblical tradition. That alone should make us pause. Why would one of the oldest Christian communities in the world keep a book that everyone else rejected? Were they clinging to a truth others had abandoned? Or were they deceived by a text that didn't belong? Depending on how you answer those questions, the Book of Jubilees becomes either a dangerous distraction or a key to unlocking what has been hidden from us all along. What's even more striking is how this book connects to the hunger many of us feel today. Think about it. Modern life is obsessed with time. We set alarms, schedule meetings, chase deadlines, and count down days to the weekend. Yet so many people confess they feel out of rhythm, disconnected, restless. Could it be that this sense of dislocation is not just psychological but spiritual? Could Jubilees be pointing us to the reason why humanity always seems exhausted and never at peace? As we begin this journey, I want you to hold on to a central thought. Jubilees doesn't just tell stories, it exposes a pattern. It suggests that creation itself was built on a rhythm, a divine pulse, and when we ignore it, chaos follows. That chaos might appear in broken communities, in distorted worship, or even in the way our bodies and minds struggle under stress. Now, I know this is a lot to take in. Maybe you're wondering, is this really possible? Could a banned book really contain truths about time, angels, and God's law that the mainstream church left behind? That's the exact tension we're going to explore. And the deeper we go, the more we'll see why Jubilees has never stopped stirring questions. Because here's the thing. The secrets inside this book aren't just ancient trivia. They challenge how we understand history, how we practice faith, and even how we structure daily life. And perhaps that is exactly why the Church Fathers decided it was too dangerous. So as we step into chapter 2, we'll leave behind the mystery and step into the controversy. Why exactly was this book excluded from the canon? Was it truly unfit, or was it silenced because it threatened the power structures of its time? To answer that, we have to revisit the early centuries of Christianity, when decisions were made that shaped the Bible we hold today. If the Book of Jubilees contains such profound ideas about time, angels, and God's eternal order, why did it vanish from the pages of most Bibles? The answer lies in the earliest centuries of Christianity, when leaders of the church faced an enormous task, deciding which writings would be preserved as scripture and which would be set aside. On the surface, this might sound like a simple process of sorting authentic texts from forgeries, but in reality, it was far more complicated and deeply political. During the 2nd and 3rd centuries after Christ, the Christian movement spread rapidly across the Roman Empire. Different communities used different collections of writings. Some relied heavily on the letters of Paul, others cherished the Gospels, and still others clung to ancient Jewish texts like Jubilees, Enoch, and Tobit. There was no single Bible. There were libraries of scrolls, debated and discussed, loved in some places and ignored in others. By the 4th century, as Christianity moved from being a persecuted minority faith to becoming the empire's official religion, church leaders decided it was time to bring order to the chaos. Councils were convened, bishops debated, and criteria were laid out for what counted as inspired scripture. They asked, was this book widely read by Christians? Did it align with what the apostles taught? Did it avoid teachings considered heretical or dangerous? On those grounds, Jubilees fell short. Not because it lacked spiritual depth, it had plenty of that, but because it didn't fit neatly into the picture the church wanted to present. Its insistence on a solar calendar challenged traditions that had already become widespread. Its portrayal of angels as guardians of time and law sounded uncomfortably close to the mystical teachings the bishops were trying to control. And its emphasis on laws and commandments handed down long before Moses created tension with the growing Christian emphasis on grace. Imagine being a bishop at one of these councils. You are under pressure from the emperor to unify the faith. You know the Roman world thrives on order and dislikes endless debates. Do you include a book that stirs controversy and threatens the fragile harmony of your churches? Or do you quietly exclude it, hoping the faithful will never ask too many questions? For many leaders, the safer option was exclusion. This decision did not mean the book disappeared overnight. Far from it. In places like Ethiopia, Jubilees continued to be read, copied, and revered as scripture. Ethiopian Christians saw no contradiction in accepting it alongside Genesis and Exodus. In their eyes, Jubilees simply filled in missing details and clarified truths that had been lost. But in the broader Christian world, especially under the influence of Rome, the book was branded apocryphal. That word, meaning hidden, often carried a double meaning. Hidden because it was too precious for the uninitiated, or hidden because it was deemed too dangerous for the ordinary believer. So was the exclusion of Jubilees a matter of spiritual discernment, or was it political convenience? That's a question historians and theologians still debate. Some argue the Church Fathers rightly recognized it as an unreliable expansion of Genesis. Others believe they silenced it precisely because it threatened institutional control. After all, if God himself had established a solar calendar and angels enforced it, then who had the authority to change the times and seasons? Not emperors, not bishops, not councils. This brings us to a deeper layer of the story, the tension between divine authority and human authority. Jubilees insists that the rhythms of creation are not up for negotiation. They were fixed at the beginning of time and written on heavenly tablets. To change them is to rebel against God's order, but the Church, aligned with empire, had already adopted a different way of marking time. Festivals like Easter were tied to the lunar cycle. The Roman calendar had been embraced for civil life. To accept Jubilees would mean acknowledging that these changes were deviations, and no institution eager for stability would willingly admit that. And so, quietly but firmly, Jubilees was set aside. It did not make the final list of 66 books we now call the Bible. Its voice was silenced in the West, though it continued to whisper in the East, preserved in Ethiopia, as a witness that not all truth can be erased. Now you might be wondering, does it really matter if one book was excluded? Isn't the Bible we have enough? For millions it is, but the existence of Jubilees forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The Bible as we know it was shaped by human decisions. Councils voted, leaders debated, emperors pressured, and in the process, some voices were amplified while others were muted. That realization can feel unsettling, but it also invites us into deeper curiosity. What else might we discover when we listen to the books that were silenced? What patterns might emerge when we place them alongside the texts we know so well? As we move into the next chapter, we'll finally step inside Jubilees itself. We'll leave behind the politics and open the scroll, reading what it actually says about sacred time. Because while its exclusion raises fascinating questions, its content is even more astonishing. The Book of Jubilees doesn't just argue, it reveals. It paints a picture of a perfect calendar guarded by angels, designed to align humanity with heaven itself, and that perhaps is the most radical claim of all. So what exactly does the Book of Jubilees reveal once you open its pages? More than any other ancient text, it insists that time itself is sacred and that God established its structure at the very beginning of creation. According to Jubilees, when the heavens and the earth were formed, the Creator didn't just shape light, land, and life. He also set the rhythm of days, weeks, seasons, and years. In other words, time was not left to chance. It was woven into the fabric of the universe with divine precision. Unlike the lunar calendars that most ancient civilizations relied on, Jubilees presents a solar calendar of 364 days. It divides the year into 4 seasons, each with exactly 91 days. That's 13 weeks per season, adding up to 52 perfect weeks every year. This design ensures that sacred observances, the Sabbath, the festivals, the appointed times, always fall on the same day of the week, without drifting across seasons as they do in lunar-based systems. Think about the implications of that. Imagine never having to recalculate when Passover should be, never adjusting Pentecost or the Day of Atonement. Every year, the same days, the same rhythm, perfectly consistent. No confusion, no compromise, just order. Jubilees claims that this was God's original design for humanity, but it goes even further. The book describes angels assigned to guard this sacred calendar. These angels, sometimes called the angels of the presence, were entrusted with maintaining the cosmic order. They oversaw the movements of the sun, the stars, and the seasons. They didn't just observe humanity, they regulated the very fabric of time. According to Jubilees, when humans followed this divinely ordained schedule, they lived in harmony with heaven. But when they abandoned it, chaos entered the world. It's not hard to see why this teaching was controversial. A divine calendar that required no priest, no emperor, no human authority to regulate it. That was dangerous to institutions that thrived on controlling time. If sacred festivals were fixed by God, not by councils, then power shifted away from human hands. Let's pause here and reflect. Do you ever feel like life itself is out of rhythm? Days rush by, weeks blur together, and even moments of worship or rest feel hurried and disjointed. Could that sense of dislocation reflect something deeper? Could it be that we are living in a system of time that was never meant for us? Jubilees suggests exactly that. The contrast between the solar calendar and the lunar calendar becomes central in the book's teaching. Jubilees warns that following a lunar-based system creates instability. Months shift, festivals drift, and the sacred order dissolves. Over time, this leads to what the book calls abominable days, moments when holy observances no longer align with God's original intention. The result is not just confusion on paper, it's spiritual disorder, a life lived off-beat from the Creator's song. And yet, even in its warnings, Jubilees offers hope. It insists that sacred time can be recovered. By aligning again with the 364-day cycle, humanity could restore the connection that was lost. In this sense, Jubilees is not simply a book of history, it's a call to return to God's rhythm. This idea resonates with modern science in surprising ways. Think of how our bodies operate on circadian rhythms, 24-hour cycles that regulate sleep, energy, and health. When those rhythms are disrupted, we suffer. Could it be that on a grander scale, humanity suffers when the divine rhythm of years and seasons is disrupted? Jubilees makes that claim boldly. When you abandon God's calendar, the entire world drifts toward chaos. It's here that we start to sense why this text was seen as a threat. If time itself is a divine covenant, then to change the calendar is not just an administrative decision, it's an act of rebellion. Jubilees declares that the structure of sacred time is written on heavenly tablets, eternal and unchangeable. To alter it is to set yourself against the very order of creation. As dramatic as this sounds, it also carries a beautiful invitation. Imagine a life in which every week flows into the next with divine rhythm. Imagine sacred festivals always arriving exactly when they should, echoing the first days of creation. Imagine living not by deadlines and overbooked calendars, but by a cosmic order that reconnects you to the Creator's rest. That's the vision of Jubilees, the vision of sacred time. And now, as we transition to the next chapter, we'll see how this vision wasn't just theoretical. According to Jubilees, the great patriarchs, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, actually lived by this rhythm. They celebrated festivals, honored the Sabbath, and followed the sacred calendar long before Moses ever received the law at Sinai. The message is clear. Divine timekeeping wasn't an afterthought. It was the foundation of faith itself. The Book of Jubilees doesn't leave the sacred calendar in the abstract. It shows us how the great patriarchs, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, lived according to this divine rhythm long before the law of Moses was ever written. In doing so, it makes a radical claim. The commandments we usually associate with Sinai were not new inventions. They were eternal truths woven into creation itself and passed down by angels to humanity's earliest ancestors. Let's begin with Noah. After the flood, Genesis tells us that God made a covenant with him, sealed by the rainbow, promising never again to destroy the earth with water. Jubilees expands this moment, describing how Noah was instructed to keep the Sabbath and observe festivals in alignment with the divine calendar. For Noah, time was not just survival after catastrophe, it was restoration. Each sacred day became a way to anchor humanity back into God's order. Think about that. Humanity had just witnessed the greatest reset in history. The world was cleansed of corruption, and Noah stood at the edge of a new beginning. According to Jubilees, God didn't just give him a promise, he gave him time, structured, holy time, as a safeguard against falling back into chaos. In other words, the rhythm of sacred days was meant to protect humanity from repeating its past mistakes. From Noah, we move to Abraham, the father of nations. Genesis presents him as a man of faith, called to leave his homeland and follow God into the unknown. Jubilees adds a new layer. It tells us that Abraham rejected the idolatry of his family, even destroying the idols in his father's house, and chose to walk in God's ways. But how did he know those ways? According to Jubilees, angels revealed the divine laws to him. He kept the Sabbath, offered sacrifices, and observed purity laws, practices we often think began with Moses. This changes how we see Abraham. He wasn't simply a pioneer of faith, he was also a keeper of ancient commandments. His obedience wasn't blind, it was informed by a divine rhythm handed down from heaven. And this raises an important question. If Abraham was already following God's laws centuries before Sinai, what does that mean for our understanding of the law itself? Jubilees would answer, the law is not temporary or cultural, it is eternal. Isaac too is portrayed as living within this rhythm. Jubilees describes him not just as the son of promise, but as someone who inherited the sacred observances from his father. He carried the covenant forward, ensuring that his household remained aligned with the heavenly order. In this way, Isaac becomes a bridge, a reminder that the rhythm of sacred time is generational, passed from father to son, meant to endure across centuries. Then comes Jacob, whose story in Genesis is already dramatic. Visions of angels, struggles with Esau, dreams of ladders reaching to heaven. Jubilees intensifies this picture by emphasizing Jacob's role as custodian of the sacred calendar. It says that God and the angels revealed to him the laws written on heavenly tablets, laws about Sabbath, festivals, and purity. Jacob wasn't just chosen to father the 12 tribes. He was entrusted with preserving the rhythm of God's time for an entire nation. Do you see the pattern emerging? Jubilees paints a consistent picture. The patriarchs were not stumbling in the dark, waiting for Moses to bring clarity. They were already living within God's rhythm, guided by angels, practicing laws that mirrored heaven. To them, time was sacred, not a human invention, but a divine inheritance. Now pause for a moment and ask yourself, what does this change about how we view our own lives? If the patriarchs understood that time itself was a covenant, do we treat it with the same reverence? Or do we, like so much of the modern world, see time only as a commodity, something to spend, to save, or to waste? Jubilees challenges us to see time as holy, as a gift to be aligned with rather than controlled. Of course, not everyone accepted this vision. Even in the ancient world, people drifted from the solar calendar into lunar systems, shifting sacred days and corrupting the rhythm. Jubilees warns that this is not a minor error. To abandon God's calendar is to walk out of step with creation itself. And the patriarchs, though faithful, lived surrounded by cultures that often did exactly that. This tension, the faithful few keeping God's rhythm while the world around them followed another beat, sets the stage for everything that follows in biblical history. It explains the conflicts Israel would later face, not just with neighboring nations, but even within its own identity. Would they live by the divine order or by human tradition? As we turn the page to the next chapter, we'll see how this struggle reaches its peak in the story of Moses. At Sinai, God gives Israel the law, not as something entirely new, but as a restoration of what had always been written on the heavenly tablets. And in that moment, the book of Jubilees suggests the rhythm of sacred time was offered again, not just to patriarchs, but to an entire people. When most people think about the giving of the law, they picture Moses on Mount Sinai, thunder, lightning, the sound of trumpets, and God's voice echoing across the wilderness. Exodus tells us that Moses received the 10 Commandments on stone tablets written by the very finger of God. But the book of Jubilees offers an even more dramatic perspective. According to this ancient text, Moses was not receiving something entirely new. He was being reminded of what had always existed, laws written long before creation itself, inscribed on what Jubilees calls the heavenly tablets. Picture this: Moses climbing the mountain, surrounded by clouds of fire, entering into the divine presence. But instead of simply hearing new instructions, he is shown records already kept in heaven. The laws of the Sabbath, purity, sacrifice, and sacred festivals were not temporary rules crafted for Israel's wilderness journey. They were eternal principles woven into the fabric of the cosmos. To Moses, Jubilees says, these laws were revealed again, not created, but restored. That idea alone changes everything. It means the law was not a cultural invention or a historical accident. It was part of the universe's design, as constant as gravity, as unshakable as the movement of the sun. If that's true, then ignoring those laws is not like breaking a human regulation. It's stepping out of alignment with creation itself. Jubilees emphasizes that angels played a critical role in this revelation. They were described as the mediators who delivered the commandments, ensuring that Moses understood their divine significance. These angels weren't inventing rules. They were showing Moses what had been etched into heaven's record since the beginning of time. This turns Sinai into more than a national covenant. It becomes a moment of unveiling, when eternal truths finally met human ears again. But why present the law this way? Perhaps because Jubilees wanted its readers to grasp the cosmic scale of obedience. The Sabbath wasn't just a rest day for Israel. It was a rhythm that even angels observed. Festivals weren't tribal traditions, they were cosmic appointments marked on heaven's calendar. To break them wasn't merely to disobey, it was to disrupt a pattern that held the world together. Now think of the tension this creates. By the time Moses stood on Sinai, Israel had already lived for centuries in Egypt. They had absorbed Egyptian ways of marking time, Egyptian festivals, Egyptian rhythms. Jubilees suggests that Sinai was, in part, a rescue mission, not just from slavery, but from distorted time. God was pulling his people back into his rhythm, away from calendars that drifted and traditions that decayed. And yet, even here, questions arise. If the law was eternal, why did so many people, even within Israel, struggle to keep it? Jubilees does not shy away from this. It warns that people will continue to deviate, adopting lunar calendars, altering festivals, and losing sight of the Sabbath. This deviation, it says, is not harmless, it's rebellion. For if the laws are eternal, written on heavenly tablets, then to alter them is to declare that human authority can rewrite heaven's design. At this point, we might pause and reflect. How do we treat God's commands today? Do we see them as negotiable, adjustable to convenience, or do we recognize them as eternal truths that keep us aligned with the Creator? Jubilees challenges us to confront this head-on. If the Sabbath was sanctified before creation, is it really just a relic of Israelite history? If sacred festivals were fixed in heaven, are they optional traditions or timeless appointments with God? Of course, the church fathers who later rejected Jubilees were keenly aware of this tension. A book that insists God's law was eternal and universal did not sit well with movements emphasizing freedom from the law. A text that claimed angels themselves obeyed the Sabbath didn't mesh with a theology that downplayed its significance. And so quietly, Jubilees was labeled too Jewish, too rigid, too dangerous to keep in the canon. But even if excluded, its message still lingers. Moses at Sinai was not hearing something new. He was being reminded of eternal truths. The Book of Jubilees insists that those truths remain valid for all time, binding not just Israel, but humanity itself. And this raises the next great question. What happens when humanity abandons them? If time is sacred and the law is eternal, what unfolds when people walk away from both? Jubilees provides a sobering answer. Rebellion leads to chaos. And nowhere is this seen more clearly than in the stories of Cain, the Nephilim, and the generations before the flood. If the Book of Jubilees is right, that God's laws were established at creation, written on heavenly tablets, and revealed to the patriarchs, then human history quickly becomes a story of rebellion against those laws. And nowhere does that rebellion appear more vividly than in the earliest generations after Adam and Eve. Cain, the Nephilim, and the wickedness of the pre-flood world show us what happens when humanity refuses the divine rhythm and follows its own. Let's begin with Cain. In Genesis, we read a short account. Cain offers a sacrifice, Abel offers another, and God looks with favor on Abel's gift, but not on Cain's. Jealousy burns, and Cain kills his brother. Jubilees retells this moment with more weight. For Cain's murder was not just a crime of jealousy, it was the first major breach of God's eternal law. The blood of Abel wasn't merely spilled, it was recorded on the heavenly tablets as a transgression that echoed through generations. Cain's act is framed as a deliberate step out of divine order, the opening of a wound in creation itself. From Cain's sin, Jubilees moves to an even darker story, the Nephilim. Genesis only hints at these mysterious figures, giants born from the union of sons of God and human women. Jubilees lingers longer, portraying the Nephilim as products of angelic rebellion. These fallen beings introduced forbidden knowledge, charms, sorcery, warfare, and bloodshed. They corrupted humanity not only by their presence, but by teaching them ways that violated God's design. Their violence filled the earth, and their appetite devoured everything in sight. Pause for a moment. Think of the imagery here. Angels, meant to guard creation, now defying God and passing secret knowledge to mortals. Giants roaming the earth, spreading terror. Humanity caught in a cycle of violence and corruption. To Jubilees, this was not just myth or legend. It was a spiritual infection, an invasion of rebellion into the world God made. The result? Chaos. Jubilees describes the world of Noah's day as utterly corrupted. All flesh, it says, corrupted its way on the earth. Men, beasts, birds and fish, everything strayed from its order. Violence was everywhere. The very balance of creation was collapsing. And so, according to Jubilees, God acted decisively. The flood was not random judgment. It was a cleansing, a cosmic reset. Humanity had abandoned the sacred calendar, ignored the Sabbath, and embraced the teachings of fallen angels. Creation itself was unraveling. Only Noah and his family found favor because they clung, however imperfectly, to righteousness. But here is where Jubilees adds something striking. After the flood, God not only promised never to destroy the earth with water again, he re-established the covenant of time. Noah was instructed about Sabbaths, purity laws, and sacrifices. In other words, the flood wasn't just about survival, it was about restoration. By teaching Noah again about sacred time and eternal law, God was stitching creation back into order. Now think about the emotional power of this story. The flood is often seen as terrifying, and it was. But in Jubilees, it's also hopeful. It shows that even when rebellion spreads and angels themselves defect, God doesn't abandon humanity. He restores, renews, and calls people back to his rhythm. There's also a personal question buried here. Have you ever felt like the world around you is spiraling out of control? Too violent, too chaotic, too broken to fix? Jubilees reminds us that chaos is not the final word. God has a way of pulling creation back to order. And just as he entrusted Noah with a new beginning, he entrusts each generation with the same call. Return to the rhythm, walk in the covenant, live by the sacred calendar. Of course, not everyone listens. Jubilees makes clear that rebellion continued after the flood too. Humanity has always struggled to stay in step with God's time, and that struggle, it says, is written into the destiny of nations, into the rise and fall of kings, and into the battles that echo through history. But for now, the lesson is simple. Cain's jealousy, the Nephilim's rebellion, the corruption of the pre-flood world, all of it points to the same truth. When humanity abandons the divine order, chaos reigns. When it returns, restoration begins. As we prepare to move forward, Jubilees will shift our focus from Noah to Abraham, the man who chose to leave behind idolatry and walk with the one true God. And once again, we'll see that the story is not just about faith, it's about time, law, and covenant, carried forward across generations. In the Bible, Abraham is remembered as the father of faith. the man who left his homeland at God's command and set out toward an unknown future. But the book of Jubilees deepens this portrait, transforming Abraham into not only a pioneer of faith, but also a revolutionary figure. He is portrayed as one who shattered the idols of his father's house, rejected the false gods of his culture, and aligned himself with the eternal laws inscribed on the heavenly tablets. In other words, Abraham didn't just believe, he obeyed a rhythm of life that had existed since creation. Jubilees tells us that Abraham grew up in a household steeped in idolatry. His father, Terah, kept carved images of stone and wood, worshipping the gods of his time. Imagine young Abraham watching his family bow before lifeless statues, feeling the emptiness of it all. One day, unable to bear it any longer, he destroyed those idols in defiance of the false religion surrounding him. This moment, according to Jubilees, marks the true beginning of Abraham's journey with God, not simply leaving Ur, but breaking with idolatry in a dramatic act of rebellion. But what makes this story even more compelling is what follows. Jubilees emphasizes that Abraham did not step into a moral void after destroying the idols. Instead, he was introduced to the eternal laws that angels themselves observed. These included the Sabbath, purity regulations, and sacrificial practices. For Abraham, faith was not an abstract feeling. It was a way of life rooted in rhythms that connected heaven and earth. Pause here and let this sink in. How often do we think of Abraham as a man of radical trust, but not necessarily of ritual observance? Jubilees challenges that view. It says Abraham was not only a believer, he was a lawkeeper centuries before Moses. He walked in a pattern established long before his time, proving that faith and obedience are not opposites, but inseparable companions. One of the most striking examples Jubilees provides is the covenant of circumcision. In Genesis 17, this act is presented as a sign between God and Abraham's descendants, but Jubilees insists circumcision was not new. It had always existed as a divine ordinance, written on the heavenly tablets from the very beginning. Abraham, therefore, was not simply initiating something novel. He was rejoining a cosmic pattern that bound humanity to God. Why does this matter? Because it reframes Abraham's obedience. His faith was not blind trust in an unpredictable deity. It was alignment with eternal truth. He wasn't inventing a new religion. He was restoring the original order that had been forgotten. Abraham becomes not only the father of Israel, but the great restorer, reconnecting human life to divine law. Think of the courage that required to walk away from family traditions, to reject the gods everyone else worshipped, to adopt practices no one around him understood. Jubilees portrays Abraham as a lonely figure at times, set apart by his faithfulness, yet sustained by the knowledge that he was walking in step with heaven. And that tension is timeless. Even today, anyone who chooses to live by divine rhythms often feels out of sync with the world. But Abraham's story in Jubilees is not just about personal devotion, it is about legacy. The text emphasizes that the laws Abraham followed were passed on to Isaac and then to Jacob. This generational continuity is key. The covenant was never meant for one man alone. It was written on heavenly tablets so that every generation could walk in the same light. Abraham becomes the model of generational faithfulness, planting seeds that would blossom into a nation bound to God. Now ask yourself, what idols surround us today? They may not be carved statues, but they are just as pervasive. Money, status, technology, self-worship. Like Abraham, we face the choice to smash the idols of our age and walk in a different rhythm. And just like him, we may feel alone when we do. But Jubilees assures us that such obedience is not meaningless. It connects us to eternal truth, to the same covenant that guided the patriarchs. In Abraham's life, the book of Jubilees draws a line. Idolatry leads to chaos, while obedience to eternal law leads to blessing. That line continues through his descendants and shapes the story of Israel itself. And so, as we move forward, the question is not only about Abraham's faith, but about what comes next. How will his son Isaac and later Jacob carry this covenant? And how will the 12 tribes inherit not only land, but the responsibility of guarding God's eternal rhythm? The story of Jacob and Esau is one of the most famous family dramas in the Bible. Two brothers locked in rivalry from the womb, one destined to inherit the blessing, the other consumed by hunger and impulse. In Genesis, we see Jacob bargaining for Esau's birthright and later disguising himself to receive his father Isaac's blessing. But the book of Jubilees takes this story further, showing that this was not just a household quarrel. It was a cosmic conflict written on the heavenly tablets, a struggle between righteousness and rebellion, between alignment with divine law and the rejection of it. From the very beginning, Jubilees says, Jacob was chosen. Even before his birth, Rebekah was told that 2 nations were within her womb, and the elder would serve the younger. Genesis 25 records this prophecy, but Jubilees emphasizes its inevitability. Jacob's destiny was not a matter of trickery or deception. It was part of the divine order. Esau, by contrast, was marked from the start as one who would rebel, a man destined to live outside the covenant's rhythm. Think of the implications here. Jacob's purchase of the birthright with a bowl of stew is often criticized as deceitful or opportunistic, but Jubilees reframes it. Jacob was simply stepping into what had already been decreed. Esau's carelessness, his willingness to trade the eternal inheritance for temporary satisfaction, only confirmed his nature. The book of Jubilees paints this not as a trick, but as the outworking of prophecy. But the contrast between the two brothers is not just about a single moment. Jubilees expands the picture, showing Esau as the ancestor of nations that would continually oppose Israel. His descendants, the Edomites, become a living symbol of rebellion against God's chosen people. In this way, the family drama becomes a template for history. Jacob represents those who align with divine law, while Esau represents those who reject it. The struggle between the two brothers becomes a struggle between two worldviews, obedience and defiance. What makes this even more powerful is how Jubilees describes Jacob's role after receiving the blessing. He is not only a favored son, he becomes the custodian of divine law. Angels are said to have revealed to him the eternal commandments, the Sabbath, purity codes, the sacred calendar, ensuring that Jacob and his descendants would remain guardians of God's order. Jacob is portrayed as more than a patriarch. He is a keeper of the covenant, entrusted with passing the laws to the 12 tribes. Pause here and reflect. The rivalry between Jacob and Esau is often seen as a cautionary tale about deceit, favoritism, or family dysfunction. But Jubilees insists that the story is cosmic. It's not about sibling rivalry, it's about the fate of nations. It's about which line would walk in alignment with God's rhythm and which would wander into rebellion. Suddenly, the details, the stew, the blessing, the disguise, are no longer petty tricks, but part of a larger divine script. And this script invites us to ask, which path are we walking? Are we like Jacob, imperfect, but striving to align with God's eternal order? Or are we like Esau, quick to trade lasting truth for fleeting satisfaction? The choice resonates even now. Every day we decide whether to value what is sacred or to sell it cheap. Jubilees also emphasizes the generational weight of this conflict. Esau's choices did not end with him. His descendants carried forward his rebellion. Likewise, Jacob's faithfulness did not end with him. His sons became the 12 tribes, guardians of the covenant. This is more than family history. It is prophecy unfolding. The destinies of entire peoples were written into the choices of these two men. Consider the emotional force of that idea. How often do we see our own decisions as small, personal, insignificant? Jubilees warns us that every choice echoes. What we embrace or reject today ripples into generations to come. Just as Esau's impulsiveness birthed nations of opposition, Jacob's perseverance sustained a legacy of faith. And so, as the story moves forward, Jacob is established as the heir of the covenant, while Esau fades into rebellion. But this is not the end of the pattern, it is only the beginning. For out of Jacob will come 12 sons, each with a role to play in preserving the eternal laws. Their births, their struggles, and their destinies are not random. According to Jubilees, even their timing is aligned with the sacred calendar written on the heavenly tablets, which leads us to the next stage of the story, the rise of the 12 tribes of Israel. For Jacob's legacy is not only his own obedience, but the nation that will carry forward the eternal covenant, and Jubilees insists that their role was not merely to inherit land, but to guard the divine rhythm itself. When Jacob became the heir of the covenant, his story did not end, it multiplied. From his 12 sons came the 12 tribes of Israel, a people chosen not only to inherit land, but to guard something far greater, the eternal law written on the heavenly tablets. The Book of Jubilees reminds us that the tribes were never merely a political group or a wandering family. They were cosmic custodians, entrusted with carrying forward rhythms of time, holiness, and obedience that stretched back to creation itself. In Genesis, the 12 sons are born through Jacob's wives, Leah and Rachel, and their maidservants Bilhah and Zilpah. The narrative describes the rivalries, the jealousies, and the struggles of a complicated family. But Jubilees pulls back the curtain, showing that behind the messy human details there was a divine timetable. Each son's birth, the text says, was written on the heavenly tablets. Their timing was no accident. Their destinies were inscribed long before they drew breath. This is a powerful idea. The tribes were not just born, they were appointed. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin were more than Jacob's children. They were living symbols of God's design, woven into the structure of time and covenant. Jubilees makes it clear their role was not to invent a nation, but to guard one, not to create a law, but to preserve one that already existed. One of the most striking details Jubilees highlights is the role of Levi. In the traditional Bible, Levi's descendants become priests. Moses, Aaron, and the Levites, who serve in the tabernacle and temple. But Jubilees pushes this even further. It claims that Levi's priesthood was not just historical circumstance, it was cosmic destiny. Long before Mount Sinai, long before Moses stood barefoot on holy ground, Levi was set apart as the eternal mediator. His priesthood was ordained on the heavenly tablets, forever connecting heaven and earth. But Levi is not alone. Judah, too, is singled out, not only as the tribe of kings, but as a sign of divine favor. Jubilees interprets the shift of power away from Reuben, the firstborn who sinned, toward Judah and Levi as more than family politics. It was the unfolding of a divine plan. The one who violated eternal law lost his place, while those aligned with God's rhythm rose to prominence. Once again, history and law intertwine. Disobedience brings downfall, but faithfulness secures destiny. Pause and reflect on this. How often do we imagine our lives as shaped only by human choices? Jubilees suggests something deeper. The destinies of whole nations can be redirected by whether or not individuals honor the divine rhythm. What we call coincidence may actually be alignment or rebellion against the eternal order written in heaven. Another theme that emerges in Jubilees is responsibility. The tribes were not chosen simply for privilege, they were entrusted with weight. Each tribe carried a specific spiritual responsibility, some with leadership, some with worship, some with guardianship of the land. Their identity was tied not to personal ambition, but to service within a larger covenant. To abandon that covenant was to unravel their very purpose. This speaks directly to us. How often do we crave blessing without responsibility, inheritance without obedience? The 12 tribes remind us that God's gifts are also God's assignments. To be chosen is to be entrusted. To inherit the covenant is to guard it faithfully. Jubilees also uses the tribes to illustrate the power of continuity. Abraham obeyed, Isaac inherited, Jacob received, but the 12 tribes multiplied the covenant into a nation. Each generation carried the flame, proving that faith was never meant to die with one person. It was meant to spread, to be taught, remembered, and lived. In that sense, the 12 tribes are less about 12 names and more about 12 channels through which God's eternal law flows into history. Yet the story is not free of failure. Jubilees does not ignore the sins of the tribes, the jealousy that led to Joseph's betrayal, the violence that scarred their reputation, the moments of idolatry and rebellion. But even here, the text insists God's plan was not undone. Their failures were recorded on the heavenly tablets, consequences were faced, but the covenant remained. Why? Because the covenant was bigger than their weakness. It was anchored in God's eternal order. And here lies another lesson. Our failures, while real, do not erase God's purpose. Like the tribes, we may stumble, we may rebel, but the divine rhythm endures. The question is whether we will return to it, realign with it, and pass it forward. As Jubilees tells it, the 12 tribes were not just ancestors of Israel, they were mirrors for every generation. Each tribe represents a choice, faithfulness or rebellion, service or selfishness, alignment or chaos. Together they remind us that covenant is not abstract, it is lived, generation by generation, person by person. Which brings us to the next movement in the story. The tribes are born, the covenant continues, but now the focus shifts to one son in particular, Joseph. His journey will not only test the bonds of family, but also set the stage for Israel's descent into Egypt. And as Jubilees will show, even betrayal and slavery are not outside the script of the heavenly tablets. For in Joseph's story, we will discover how God weaves suffering into destiny, turning human sin into a stage for divine redemption. Among Jacob's 12 sons, Joseph shines as the dreamer, the favored child, the one clothed in a robe of many colors. Genesis tells us how jealousy drove his brothers to sell him into slavery. But the book of Jubilees places this betrayal within a larger cosmic framework. According to Jubilees, Joseph's journey to Egypt was not only the result of family conflict, but a divine appointment, written on the heavenly tablets, designed to preserve Israel and set the stage for God's future acts of deliverance. The story begins with sin. His brothers, consumed by envy, conspired against him. In Genesis, their guilt is personal, a mix of resentment and rivalry, but Jubilees insists their actions were more than a family feud. Their betrayal was recorded as a great transgression against the eternal law. By rejecting their brother, they were rejecting God's plan. Their sin carried consequences that would ripple across generations, leading to suffering in Egypt. And yet, here lies the paradox. Even their rebellion was folded into the divine design. Jubilees reminds us that God had already written Joseph's destiny long before his brothers cast him into a pit. His path to Egypt was not an accident, but a step toward salvation. The betrayal became the doorway to redemption. This is a theme repeated throughout the book. Human disobedience may delay or complicate, but it cannot undo God's eternal order. Consider Joseph's rise in Egypt. In Genesis, his wisdom and ability to interpret dreams elevate him from slave to governor. Jubilees agrees, but adds a crucial detail. Angels themselves were sent to protect him. From the moment he was sold, heavenly messengers ensured his survival, guarding him from death, guiding his steps, and positioning him for influence. This was not luck or mere resilience. It was divine orchestration. Joseph's very life was precious in God's sight, and his destiny was safeguarded by heaven. Pause for a moment. How often do we look at our hardships as random misfortunes? Jubilees challenges us to see them differently. Could it be that even in betrayal, even in suffering, God is weaving a larger plan? Joseph's slavery was not the end of his story. It was the beginning of his calling. What seems like loss may actually be preparation. Jubilees also emphasizes the prophetic weight of Joseph's role. His leadership during Egypt's famine saved countless lives, but more than that, it fulfilled a design written long before. His position ensured that Jacob's family would come to Egypt, where they would grow into a nation. Their eventual enslavement, Jubilees says, was already foretold on the heavenly tablets. What looked like tragedy was actually the setup for the Exodus. Joseph was not only a savior in his own generation, he was a key piece in the unfolding of God's redemptive plan for centuries to come. This raises a difficult question. Can suffering itself be part of God's design? Jubilees answers with nuance. Human sin caused Joseph's pain. His brothers' envy was real, their guilt undeniable. But God, in his sovereignty, transformed their evil into a stage for his glory. The message is not that suffering is good, but that suffering is never wasted. Even betrayal can become the soil where redemption grows. Another fascinating addition Jubilees brings is the involvement of the heavenly tablets. It insists that Joseph's destiny, his betrayal, his rise to power, and even the length of Israel's stay in Egypt were all recorded before time. This detail lifts the story from human drama to cosmic narrative. It's no longer just about one family's struggle. It's about heaven's script unfolding on earth. Think of how this reframes our own lives. If Joseph's suffering had purpose, could ours? If his story was written, might ours also carry meaning beyond what we see? Jubilees invites us to trust that even when circumstances appear chaotic, they may be moving in harmony with a higher order. Finally, the book of Jubilees draws attention to Joseph's faithfulness. Despite betrayal, false accusation, and imprisonment, he remained righteous. Angels may have protected him, but his choices mattered too. He resisted temptation, he honored God, and he trusted when he had every reason to despair. His righteousness aligned him with the eternal law, ensuring that he could step into the role God had written for him. And so, the story of Joseph in Jubilees is not just one of survival, but of divine purpose. Betrayal became blessing, slavery became salvation, suffering became set up for redemption. The line of covenant continued through him, proving once again that God's eternal order cannot be broken. As Joseph's story draws to its close, we see the Israelites settling in Egypt under his protection. But Jubilees warns us that this blessing would turn into bondage. The same land that offered safety would one day become the furnace of oppression. And yet, even that was not outside of God's plan. Their suffering in Egypt was foretold, their deliverance already scheduled on the divine calendar. Which leads us to the next chapter, the enslavement of Israel and the rise of God's power through the Exodus. When Joseph welcomed his family into Egypt, it was a time of relief. Famine had been defeated, hunger replaced with abundance, and the children of Israel flourished under Pharaoh's favor. But the book of Jubilees warns us that this season of comfort was only temporary. Their blessing would soon turn into bondage, and their prosperity into oppression. And here lies the striking claim of Jubilees. Even Israel's slavery was not an accident of history, but part of a divine prophecy written on the heavenly tablets long before it began. According to Jubilees, the very descent of Jacob's family into Egypt was already a fulfillment of God's script. Their settlement was not random, it was the setup for a greater act of deliverance. The heavenly tablets had recorded not only their growth, but also their suffering. For God's plan was not merely to preserve them, but to shape them into a nation forged in fire, tested in the crucible of oppression, and prepared to receive His law. Think about that. What most of us would see as tragedy, Jubilees portrays as training. Egypt was not only the place of bondage, it was the womb where Israel would grow from family into nation. The harsh labor, the humiliation, the cries of suffering, none of it was wasted. It was all part of God's rhythm, designed to reveal His power at the appointed time. But the suffering was real. Jubilees does not minimize the cruelty. It describes how Pharaoh, hardened by evil influences, turned the children of Israel into slaves. They were forced into backbreaking labor, building cities that were not theirs, working fields they would never inherit. Their cries echoed across the land, and their faith was tested daily. Yet even in this darkness, God's plan was advancing. Jubilees goes further, introducing the role of spiritual warfare. It says that Mastema, the leader of evil spirits, was at work behind the scenes, hardening Pharaoh's heart and urging the Egyptians to crush Israel with relentless oppression. This was more than politics, more than economics. It was a cosmic battle between good and evil, between God's chosen people and the forces determined to destroy them. Every whip crack, every tear, every sigh under the sun was part of a larger spiritual struggle. And here we pause to ask, how do we interpret suffering in our own lives? Do we see only the cruelty of the oppressor, or can we believe, as Jubilees insists, that God's hand is still at work? For the Israelites, it must have seemed like abandonment. Yet the heavenly tablets declared otherwise. Deliverance was written before their bondage began. One of the most fascinating details Jubilees adds is about timing. It claims that even the exact day of the Exodus was preordained from creation. On the 14th day of the first month, the people would go free. This was not chance, it was cosmic scheduling. The same God who set the stars in their courses had already set the hour of Israel's liberation. Their suffering had an expiration date, and Pharaoh's power was doomed to collapse right on schedule. This perspective changes everything. The Israelites were not slaves of Egypt, they were students in God's timetable. Pharaoh thought he owned their bodies, but God owned their destiny. Their bondage was not endless chaos, it was an unfolding prophecy. Jubilees also insists that during this time, the faith of Israel was refined. Some wavered, tempted to despair. Others clung fiercely to the promises of their fathers, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. These choices mattered. Just as Esau's descendants embodied rebellion and Jacob's line carried the covenant, so too did the Israelites in Egypt reveal where their loyalty lay. Would they surrender to fear, or would they trust that God would act at the appointed time? Here lies a question for us. When life feels like bondage, when prayers go unanswered and burdens grow heavy, do we see only the chains, or do we dare to believe there is a larger script, a rhythm that has not yet reached its climax? Jubilees urges us to believe the latter, that suffering is not the end, but the preparation for deliverance. And so the stage was set. Israel groaned under the weight of Egypt. Mastema whispered lies into Pharaoh's heart, and the people cried out. Yet heaven was not silent. The appointed hour was near. Soon the God who inscribed the calendar of creation would unleash his power, not only to free his people, but to demonstrate that no earthly kingdom, no spiritual power could stand against him. The oppression of Israel was real, but it was also temporary. Pharaoh's throne was high, but heaven's throne was higher. And as Jubilees makes clear, the very day of liberation was already written. Which brings us to the next act in the story, the plagues of Egypt. For when God moves to deliver, he does not whisper, he shakes the world. When the cries of Israel reached the heavens, God's response was not silence, but thunder. The book of Jubilees tells us that the plagues of Egypt were not just punishments aimed at a stubborn Pharaoh. They were cosmic signs, acts of warfare against the forces of darkness, demonstrations that the gods of Egypt and the spirits of rebellion had no power before the Lord of heaven and earth. In the traditional account of Exodus, we see a sequence of plagues: blood in the Nile, frogs, gnats, darkness, death. But Jubilees lifts the curtain higher, revealing that each plague was more than nature gone wild. Each one was aimed at disempowering false gods and exposing Pharaoh's arrogance. Egypt was not merely an empire of bricks and armies. It was a kingdom built on spiritual deception. The plagues dismantled that deception piece by piece. The first plague, turning the Nile into blood, was a direct blow against Egypt's greatest idol, the river that gave them life. To the Egyptians, the Nile was a god. To Israel's God, it was clay in his hands. Jubilees underscores the message. The waters they worshipped could not save them. Only the Creator had the power to give or withhold life. The later plagues struck against animals, crops, and even the sun. Each judgment was targeted, stripping away Egypt's confidence in its gods. Jubilees explains that these events were not random disasters, but deliberate acts recorded on the heavenly tablets, perfectly timed in accordance with God's cosmic calendar. The purpose was clear: to show Israel and Egypt alike that only the Lord is sovereign, and that rebellion against his law leads to chaos. And yet behind Pharaoh's stubbornness, Jubilees introduces another layer: the influence of Mastema. This prince of evil spirits, already seen hardening Pharaoh's heart during Israel's oppression, continued his work throughout the plagues. Every refusal, every boast, every act of defiance was fueled by his whispers. Pharaoh was not only resisting Moses, he was the puppet of darker forces determined to block God's plan. The plagues, therefore, were not only political or natural, they were spiritual battles, signs of heaven's victory over hell's schemes. Pause here. How often do we look at the struggles of our world, wars, injustice, oppression, and think they are merely human? Jubilees warns us, what happens in history is also shaped by unseen powers. But it also reassures us, those powers cannot stand when God decides to act. Another striking detail Jubilees emphasizes is the timing of the final plague, the death of the firstborn. This was not an arbitrary night of terror. It was scheduled on the divine calendar, aligning with the 14th day of the first month. This exact timing would later be linked to Passover, the Feast of Liberation, tying Israel's history of deliverance to the rhythm of sacred time. The blood on the doorposts was not just a sign of protection, it was a marker of covenant, a visible alignment with God's eternal order. The plagues also served another purpose: to strengthen Israel's faith. In the face of each wonder, the Israelites saw not just their enemy humbled, but their God exalted. Jubilees portrays these moments as lessons for the generations, reminders that no empire is greater than God's will, and no darkness can quench his light. The plagues were not only judgments, they were revelations, teaching Israel to trust in the Lord who commanded the stars, the seas, and time itself. And here we see the dual edge of divine power. For Egypt, the plagues were devastation. For Israel, they were deliverance. The same hand that crushed Pharaoh lifted God's people out of despair. Jubilees insists that this contrast was intentional, to prove that alignment with God brings life, while rebellion against him brings destruction. This invites us to reflect. In our own time, do we trust in systems, powers, or idols that cannot save? The Egyptians thought their gods could protect them. They were wrong. Israel learned that only covenant faithfulness matters. Jubilees calls us to ask, what would God expose in our lives if he sent plagues today? What false securities would crumble? The climax of the plagues came with a shattering truth. Egypt's empire was powerless. Pharaoh's heart, once so proud, was broken. His armies, once feared, were soon to be drowned. But the lesson was not only for him, it was for all humanity. God alone rules the calendar of history. His law is not bound to one nation, his timing not subject to kings. And so, as the last cries of Egypt faded into the night, the dawn of liberation rose for Israel. The people prepared to march, their hands still trembling from the wonder they had seen, their hearts stirred with the hope of freedom. The Exodus was at hand. And Jubilees insists this moment was no accident. It was written from the foundation of the world. Next, we move from judgment to journey. Israel, once enslaved, will walk out as a free people, guided by God's hand. But freedom is never aimless. As Jubilees reveals, their deliverance was designed to bring them into covenant, to receive laws already written in heaven. The plagues showed God's power. What comes next will show his purpose. The Exodus was not the end of Israel's story. It was the beginning of a greater purpose. In Genesis and Exodus, we see a people freed from Egypt, but in the book of Jubilees, their liberation is only the doorway to something eternal. the reception of laws that were not invented at Sinai, but inscribed on the heavenly tablets since before creation. According to Jubilees, the commandments given to Moses were not temporary regulations or cultural customs. They were timeless, eternal, woven into the very fabric of the universe. This idea changes everything. If the law was already written in heaven, then Moses was not creating something new. He was revealing what had always been there. The law was eternal, binding angels and humans alike, part of a cosmic rhythm that governs all creation. Pause for a moment. What does it mean to think of law not as human invention, but as divine order? It means that obedience is not just moral behavior. It is alignment with the structure of reality itself. To live by God's law is to live in harmony with heaven. To reject it is to step into chaos. Jubilees emphasizes that the heavenly tablets contained all things: the Sabbath, the festivals, purity laws, even the calendar itself. When Moses ascended Sinai, he was not entering new territory, but uncovering ancient truth. And the angels were part of this process. They too observed the Sabbath and the festivals. They lived in obedience to these eternal laws. Humanity was invited into a pattern that heaven had already been keeping. This is a sharp departure from how many think of the Old Testament law. In the traditional view, the law begins with Moses and ends with Christ. Jubilees disrupts that idea, saying the law predates both. Abraham kept it, Noah honored it, Adam received it. Moses did not create the law, he delivered it in its fullness. One of the most striking aspects Jubilees stresses is the cosmic calendar. Time itself was governed by the heavenly tablets, and the Mosaic law was inseparable from that calendar. The Sabbath, the Jubilee years, the festivals, they were not arbitrary dates but divine appointments, aligned with the solar cycle of 364 days. This calendar was eternal. Deviating from it meant disorder. Following it meant harmony. Consider what that means for Israel at Sinai. Their freedom from Egypt was not simply political liberation. It was realignment with God's cosmic order. They had been enslaved under Pharaoh's chaotic rule. Now they were being re-anchored in a divine rhythm. The law was more than commandments. It was restoration. And yet Jubilees does not present the law as burdensome. It presents it as gift, as wisdom, as light. It is the way the angels themselves live. This raises a question. If heaven itself observes these laws, how much more should humanity, who was created in God's image, follow them? To disobey was not merely to break rules, it was to rebel against the design of creation. This cosmic framing makes sense of why Jubilees insists that Israel's faithfulness or rebellion shaped their destiny. When they aligned with the eternal law, they prospered. When they deviated, they fell into chaos, just as Adam did when he ignored God's first instructions. Law is not arbitrary restriction, it is the architecture of life. Reflect on this. In our time, we often think of freedom as doing whatever we want. Jubilees pushes against that, arguing that true freedom is alignment with God's structure. To live outside His law is not freedom, but slavery to disorder. Israel's journey from Egypt to Sinai symbolizes this truth. They were not free until they were in covenant. Another unique aspect Jubilees highlights is that the law is not only for Israel, it is eternal, binding angels as well as humans. The Sabbath, for example, was sanctified not just for Jews, but for all creation from the very first week. The festivals were not cultural, but cosmic. In heaven and on earth, all beings were called to keep them. Moses' reception of the law was the unveiling of something universal. This idea raises a profound question. If the law was eternal, then rejecting it is not simply disobedience to a nation's covenant, it is rebellion against the entire order of creation. Could this be why the consequences of sin are so destructive? Because sin tears at the fabric of reality itself. Jubilees insists that every detail of the law mattered. It was not about ritual for its own sake, but about participation in the eternal design. To follow God's law was to step into harmony with heaven. To ignore it was to drift toward chaos. Thus, the Mosaic law, far from being a burden, was a revelation of God's heart and his structure for creation. The Israelites at Sinai were not just receiving instructions, they were being invited into heaven's rhythm, into a way of life that angels themselves honored. Their destiny as a nation depended on whether they would embrace this eternal order or resist it. And so, Jubilees paints Sinai not as the beginning, but as a continuation, a moment when hidden truth became visible. The covenant was not new, it was eternal, revealed in the right time, at the right place, to the right people, so that the world could see what had always been written in heaven. But the question remains, would Israel walk in that rhythm, or would they repeat the mistakes of their ancestors? Their future hinged on this choice. And as Jubilees unfolds, it becomes clear that the tension between obedience and rebellion, law and chaos, will shape not only Israel's destiny, but the destiny of the world. If the Mosaic law revealed God's eternal order, the prophetic visions of Jubilees unveil how history itself is scripted within that order. According to this book, nothing that happens in Israel's journey or in the world at large is random. Every exile, every return, every rise and fall of nations is written on the heavenly tablets, fixed long before human eyes ever saw them unfold. Time is not a chaos of accidents, but a divine schedule moving toward a predetermined climax. Jubilees declares that Israel's rebellions, their captivities, and even their restorations were foreseen and inscribed. Their suffering under Egypt, their wandering in the wilderness, their later exiles to Babylon and beyond, all of these events were foretold, woven into the fabric of prophecy. To human eyes, rebellion looked like failure, but to the cosmic perspective of the heavenly tablets, it was the outworking of warnings long given. Nothing could escape the rhythm of God's order. This raises a profound reflection. How do we view history? Do we see wars, collapses, and revolutions as random, or as Jubilees insists, do we recognize them as events unfolding within God's calendar, each one appointed to reveal his justice and his mercy? For the Israelites, their story was not a series of mistakes. It was a testimony of prophecy fulfilled, time and again. Jubilees goes further, pointing toward the end of days. It describes a time when Israel will turn back to God after seasons of rebellion and exile. Their restoration is not uncertain. It is guaranteed, recorded on the heavenly tablets. This return is not just political, but spiritual. The people will once again walk in holiness, renewed in covenant, prepared for the establishment of God's kingdom on earth. This prophecy is deeply tied to the cosmic battle woven throughout Jubilees. Mastema and the forces of darkness continue to resist, stirring nations against God's people, corrupting human hearts, and attempting to derail the divine plan. Yet their efforts are doomed. The tablets have already declared their defeat. Just as the plagues broke Pharaoh, so too will the end times break the power of evil once and for all. One of the most striking elements Jubilees introduces is the role of angels in the final judgment. They are not passive observers. They are God's agents of justice, descending to separate the righteous from the wicked, to gather those who have remained faithful, and to cast the rebellious into destruction. In this vision, judgment is not abstract, it is cosmic, enacted by heavenly beings who ensure that God's will is done on earth as it is in heaven. Consider what that means for Israel's destiny. Their suffering was temporary, their exile foreseen, but their restoration eternal. Jubilees paints a picture of a redeemed nation, not just surviving, but thriving under God's rule, their hearts aligned with the law inscribed from the beginning. It is a vision of renewal, not only for Israel, but for all creation. And here lies the hope embedded in prophecy. No matter how dark the story grows, the end has already been written. The forces of evil may rage, nations may rise against God's people, but the outcome is fixed. Restoration is not a possibility, it is a certainty. Jubilees anchors this hope in the tablets, assuring that what God has recorded cannot be erased. This leads us to reflect on our own time. When the world feels unstable, when faith seems under siege, do we despair? Or do we anchor ourselves in the conviction that history is not drifting but directed? Jubilees challenges us to see our present struggles through the lens of prophecy, trusting that even chaos serves the rhythm of God's design. The end times described in Jubilees are not only about destruction, but about renewal. Evil will be bound, the righteous vindicated, and the covenant restored in its fullness. The Messiah's reign will mark the dawn of eternal peace, where God's law is not debated, but inscribed on human hearts. This is not merely the triumph of Israel, it is the triumph of creation itself, restored to the harmony God intended from the first week of time. The narrative draws to a close with a sweeping vision, the wicked cast away, the righteous shining like stars, the law upheld forever, and God's kingdom established without end. The tablets, once glimpsed by angels and prophets, are now unveiled in their fullness. History, prophecy, and eternity converge. And so, Jubilees leaves us with a haunting but hopeful truth. The end was written from the beginning. The struggles of nations, the failures of people, the battles between light and darkness, all of it bends toward a conclusion already inscribed. Our task is not to control the outcome, but to choose our alignment. Will we walk in the order of God's law, or resist it and fall with the rebellion? This is the heartbeat of Jubilee's prophetic vision. History is not random, destiny is not guesswork, and the end will reveal the eternal triumph of God's plan. The prophetic arc of Jubilees does not end with Israel's restoration. It reaches further to the horizon of time itself, where the final judgment and the establishment of God's eternal kingdom bring the story of creation to its true climax. Everything written on the heavenly tablets, every law, every covenant, every prophecy, converges in this moment when history dissolves into eternity. Jubilees paints a vivid picture of this last act. The wicked, who resisted God's law and aligned themselves with rebellion, are not left in ambiguity. They are cast into destruction, into the lake of fire, their legacy erased from the memory of creation. Evil spirits, led by Mastema, are bound and silenced, their power broken forever. The cosmic struggle that began when angels fell is resolved with their final defeat. The rebellion that poisoned earth and heaven alike is ended. But for the righteous, the vision is entirely different. Jubilees tells us that those who kept the covenant, who walked in God's order, who aligned their lives with the eternal law, will shine like the stars of heaven. Their destiny is not only survival, but glorification. They inherit the earth renewed, a creation restored to the harmony of its beginning. This dual vision, judgment and renewal, reminds us that history is not a cycle without resolution. It is a story with an ending, and that ending is decisive. Good triumphs, evil perishes, and God's kingdom reigns without rival. Pause for a moment. How often do we think of the end of history with fear? Jubilees flips this perspective. For those who belong to God, the end is not terror, but hope. Judgment is not merely punishment, it is purification, the clearing away of corruption so that life can flourish in its fullness. One of the most profound elements of Jubilee's description is its insistence that God's law will be written on human hearts. The eternal order that once seemed distant, inscribed on heavenly tablets and revealed through angels, will now live within the redeemed. No longer will obedience depend on memory or teaching. It will be instinctive, natural, as much a part of life as breath. In this eternal kingdom, heaven's rhythm and human rhythm become one. The Messiah's role is central in this vision. Though Jubilees does not use the same language later traditions employ, the expectation is clear. A chosen ruler will reign, ensuring that justice, peace, and covenant faithfulness are upheld forever. This is not merely political leadership. It is divine kingship, the restoration of creation's true order. In the Messiah's reign, humanity returns to what was intended from the beginning: harmony with God and stewardship of the world. And what of time itself? Jubilees suggests that the cycles, jubilees, and sacred calendars all reach their fulfillment in the eternal kingdom. The rhythms that once guided Israel, the Sabbaths, the festivals, the Jubilee years, become not only memorials of God's past acts, but celebrations in His eternal presence. The structure of time, once corrupted by human disobedience, is restored to its perfect alignment. Eternity itself is ordered worship. This vision leads us to ask difficult questions. Are we living as if history has no end, chasing fleeting idols like the Egyptians who trusted the Nile? Or are we aligning our lives with the eternal, preparing to stand when the tablets of heaven are unveiled in full? Jubilees challenges us not to treat prophecy as distant myth, but as an urgent call to live now in the rhythm of God's law. Another striking feature of this final vision is its cosmic scale. The judgment is not confined to one nation or one era. It encompasses angels, humans, nations, and creation itself. The final victory is total, leaving no corner of rebellion unaddressed. This is why Jubilees insists the end was written from the beginning, so that nothing in creation could boast that it escaped God's design. The emotional weight of this prophecy is immense. For the faithful, it is reassurance that every sacrifice, every act of obedience, every moment of trust was not wasted. For the rebellious, it is a sobering reminder that nothing built on deception will endure. In the end, only what aligns with God's eternal order will remain. And so, Jubilees closes its vision with triumph. The kingdom of God established on earth, the righteous shining, the wicked silenced, the angels rejoicing, and the eternal law reigning without end. It is not merely the conclusion of Israel's story, it is the consummation of creation itself. The Book of Jubilees, once banned, hidden, and dismissed, whispers this truth, that the end of the world is not chaos, but order restored, not darkness, but light eternal. The fallen angels who corrupted creation will be no more. The faithful who endured will see God face to face, and the law once written in heaven will be written forever in the hearts of His people. The story that began with creation now ends with recreation. The Sabbath, sanctified at the beginning, continues in eternity. The covenant made with Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, all of it finds fulfillment in the eternal kingdom. This is not the end of the story. It is the story's true beginning. The journey through the Book of Jubilees has taken us from creation to covenant, from rebellion to redemption, and finally, into the eternal kingdom. Along the way, we have seen how this ancient, often forgotten text insists on one radical idea: that time, law, and destiny are not accidents, but part of God's eternal design. We began with the mystery of why Jubilees was hidden, excluded from most Bibles, and even called dangerous. We discovered that within its pages lies a vision of sacred time, a solar calendar aligned with heaven itself, guarded by angels and inscribed on the heavenly tablets. We saw how it presents the law not as a burden, but as an eternal rhythm, binding both humans and angels, guiding creation into harmony. The narrative revealed how even the patriarchs, Adam, Noah, Abraham, were already living by this eternal law before Moses ever walked Sinai. We saw how the failures of Cain, the corruption of the Nephilim, and the sins of nations were not random tragedies, but results of stepping outside God's cosmic order. And we followed Israel's journey as more than history. It was prophecy, written long before it unfolded. The heart of Jubilees is both warning and hope. It warns that when humanity rejects God's structure, chaos follows: wars, corruption, exile, bondage. But it also offers hope that God has not abandoned creation. The heavenly tablets declare restoration, redemption, and renewal. Even the end of days is not fear but fulfillment, the binding of evil, the shining of the righteous, and the reign of God's eternal kingdom. Now the question turns to us. What do we do with this vision? Do we treat it as ancient myth, interesting but irrelevant? Or do we allow it to challenge the way we live, the way we keep time, the way we align our hearts? Jubilees invites us not only to learn history, but to step into eternity, to live now as if God's law is already written in our hearts. Ask yourself, where have you been living out of rhythm? Where have you trusted in human calendars, human systems, human wisdom, instead of God's eternal design? What would it mean to reorder your days, your choices, even your thoughts, around His rhythm rather than the world's? And perhaps most importantly, do you believe the end was written from the beginning? That history is not drifting but directed? That even in chaos, God's plan is moving toward restoration? If so, then every act of faith, every step of obedience, every moment of trust is not wasted. It is alignment with eternity. As we close, let this not be the end of your journey, but a beginning. Dive deeper, ask harder questions, open the hidden texts, seek the mysteries that many have ignored. And remember, the point is not just knowledge, it is transformation. The Book of Jubilees is not just about what happened long ago. It is about what is happening now and what will happen forever. If this exploration stirred something in you, share your thoughts in the comments. What part of Jubilees challenges you most? The cosmic calendar, the angels of time, the idea that the law is eternal. Let's keep uncovering these mysteries together. And don't stop here. In our next deep dive, we'll explore the Book of Enoch, another banned text filled with visions of fallen angels, heavenly secrets, and prophecies about the end of days. If Jubilees gave us the structure of time, Enoch will show us the drama of heaven's rebellion. You won't want to miss it. Until then, remember this: creation's story is not finished, and neither is yours. The tablets of heaven still speak. The question is, are you listening?